Okay, guys, so we're looking at the follow-up questions from the third section of Death in Venice. Questions 5 to 8 on the lesson resource. I'm starting with this one. How does this extract reveal the ways in which Aschenbach is capable of deluding himself? So we're looking at the passage on page 227 where he finds himself observing Tadzio, his vigil over Tadzio, his attentive observance of the child. So we're looking at this passage here. It almost seemed to him that he was sitting here for the purpose of protecting the half-sleeping boy, busy with doings of his own, and yet nevertheless constantly keeping watch over this noble human creature, there on his right, only a little way from him. And his heart was filled and moved with a paternal fondness, the tender concern by which he who sacrifices himself to beget beauty in his spirit is drawn to him who possesses beauty. After midday, he left the beach, returned to the hotel, and took the lift up to his room. Here he spent some time in front of the looking-glass, studying his grey hair, his weary, sharp-featured face. At that moment he thought of his fame, reflected that many people recognized him in the streets and would gaze at him respectfully, saluting the unerring and graceful power of his language. He recalled all the external successes he could think of that his talent had brought him, even calling to mind his elevation to the nobility. Now, there's, again, a lot going on here in terms of who is aware of what. Again, Aschenbach is engaged in this kind of self-persuasion that he is... that his interest in Tadzio is in some way based on his intellect and his own aesthetic concern with the boy's embodiment of a kind of Platonic ideal of beauty. And so it almost seemed to him that he was sitting here for the purpose of protecting the half-sleeping boy. So again, you can see in this sort of tentative phrasing that he's not even fully convinced with his own explanation of this kind of protective interest that he's claiming over Tadzio as he watches him over the beach. And he's busy with doings of his own, and yet nevertheless keeping watch over this noble human creature. And so in the case that we're talking about at this moment in time, where he is only there purely to observe the boy, there's a full sense of absurdity here. Busy with doings of his own and yet nevertheless constantly keeping watch. There's an impossible kind of contradiction about this statement that is based on really providing a linguistic justification for his own interest in the boy. And then the phrasing of noble human creature, again, just distances Tadzio somewhat from the reality of the fact that he is a human and a child. He manages to, in some way, dehumanize him and turn him into an object of aesthetic contemplation with his language. His heart was filled and moved with a paternal fondness. And so again, we have this sense of an intensive emotional reaction to the experience that here Aschenbach is convincing himself is based on, fatherly impulses. But then, again, uses his aesthetic rationale to justify this. The tender concern by which he who sacrifices himself to beget beauty in the spirit is drawn to him who possesses beauty. So again, he sees his commitment to aesthetic beauty as a spiritual endeavor and something that is compelling him to be drawn to Tadzio, who is the embodiment of that ideal. And so again, he's using that kind of Platonic aesthetic rationalism to, in some way, justify his interest in the boy. However, the important irony involved here is what he finds himself immediately doing in response to this. He left the beach, returned to the hotel, and spent some time in front of the looking-glass studying his grey hair, his weary, sharp-featured face. And so his response is actually with a sort of physical and intellectual vanity to the observance of Tadzio's beauty. And so we wonder then, can we take this at face value, this claim that he's moved with paternal fondness? It's an unusual dad that finds himself observing the beauty of his children and then using it as a reflection on his own loss of that beauty or his loss of youth. And what we also then have here is this kind of echo of the man on the boat, of the aged man on the boat. This is the beginning of Aschenbach's kind of physical deterioration. What we can see here again is this layer of irony in the narration where Aschenbach is actually unaware of the holes in his rationale and the illogical nature of what he's saying. But the narrator seems in some way to have this restrained sense of awareness that Aschenbach's explanations to himself are in some way weak and illogical. So moving on to the next one, on 228, the description of Tadzio's teeth, and then the Venetian atmosphere at the start of the third paragraph. And we're trying to think about the possible connections between Tadzio's appearance and the place itself, and what that suggests about Aschenbach and his own internal conflict. So we look here at this description of Tadzio. He had noticed that Tadzio's teeth were not as attractive as they might have been, rather jagged and pale, lacking the luster of health and having that peculiar brittle transparency which is sometimes found in cases of anemia. He's very delicate, he's sickly, thought Aschenbach. He'll probably not live to grow old. And he made no attempt to explain to himself a certain feeling of satisfaction or relief that accompanied this thought. So again, there's this range of possible meanings in this statement, which is unusual. There's obviously a sense of satisfaction that the boy's potential degeneration mirrors his own. And again, draws into question the extent to which he is aware of his own physical and moral decline, which is reflected on in the previous section, but also a sort of a relief that actually this supposedly ideal embodiment of beauty is not so beautiful and out of his league physically as he had initially believed, which on a human level makes sense, on the level of logic and the logic of the libido, of sexual desire. But on the level of his own intellectual rationale, the basis for his interest in the boy, we've got this taint of this idealized beauty, and yet no alteration in his interest in the boy himself. So again, that sense of it being an ideal beauty is complicated by this description, and it exposes the flaws in Aschenbach's own logic. And we have this description of Venice. An unpleasant sultriness, kind of a sensory, kind of indulgent atmosphere, pervaded the narrow streets. The air was so thick that the exhalations from houses and shops and hot food stalls, the reek of oil, the smell of perfume, and many other odours hung about in clouds instead of dispersing. Cigarette smoke lingered and was slow to dissipate. The throng of people in the alleyways annoyed him as he walked instead of giving him pleasure. The further he went, the more overwhelmingly he was affected by that appalling condition sometimes caused by a combination of the sea air with the sirocco, a condition of simultaneous excitement and exhaustion. He began to sweat disagreeably. His eyes faltered. His chest felt constricted. He was feverish. The blood throbbed in his head. He fled from the crowded commercial thoroughfares over bridges into the poor quarters. There he was besieged by beggars, and the sickening stench from the canals made it difficult to breathe. In a silent square, one of those places in the depths of Venice that seemed to have been forgotten and put under a spell, he rested on the edge of a fountain, wiped the sweat from his brow, and realized that he would have to leave. And so we have again here, in this intense, almost kind of claustrophobic description and olfactory imagery that Thomas Mann uses in his depiction of the setting here, this suffocating sense of potential menace, of potential physical degeneration in the place itself that mirrors Tadzio's physical degeneration. And all these various forms of degeneration forewarn us about Aschenbach's own moral degeneration and his inability to get the best of the impulses that are driving him towards his own ruin. Now, the strange description of his simultaneous exhaustion and excitement gives us this combination that, again, shows us that he's struggling to make sense of his own state of being, that he's in some way kind of provoked by this intensive, sultry atmosphere because it's based on that sort of Dionysian passionate impulse. However, he's aware that there's something deleterious about this. There's something damaging towards his own state of being and health. And so he's torn between that state of excitement and exhaustion, but resolves at the bottom that he needs to leave. And so here, this is his sort of Apollonian logic speaking. It's saying to him, get out of here. This place is a threat to you. You are on a trajectory, a kind of downward trajectory of decline if you remain in this location, obviously motivated by your passionate attachment to a child. And so there's a suggestion here about Aschenbach's internal conflict in the way that he chooses to respond to this momentarily logical thinking. The final questions concern this. So it says on page 231, examine the description of Aschenbach's torment over his decision to leave Venice, beginning what had been a mere qualm of compunction this morning, down to tolerate that inadequacy and acknowledge it. So thinking how this passage gives the reader the sense that Aschenbach's behaviour is being directed by a force beyond his own control. So on 231, we're looking here. What had been a mere qualm of compunction this morning, a slight stirring of doubt as to the wisdom of his behaviour, now became grief, became real suffering, an anguish of the soul, so bitter that several times it brought tears to his eyes, and which, as he told himself, he could not possibly have foreseen. What he found so hard to bear, what was indeed at times quite unendurable, was evidently the thought that he would never see Venice again, that his was a parting for forever. For since it had become clear a second time that the city made him ill, since he had been forced a second time to leave it precipitately, he must, of course, from now on regard it as an impossible and forbidden place to which he was not suited, and which it would be senseless to attempt to revisit. Indeed, he felt that if he left now, shame and pride must prevent him from ever setting eyes again on this beloved city, which twice physically defeated him, and this contention between his soul's desire and his physical capacity suddenly seemed to the aging Aschenbach so grave and important, the bodily inadequacy so shameful, so necessary to overcome at all costs, that he could not understand the facile resignation with which he had decided yesterday, without any serious struggle, to tolerate that inadequacy and to acknowledge it. So we have to pay attention to the dynamic of what motivates his thinking here, rather than the actual thinking that he articulates. Because in this opening section, there's something kind of intensely felt about his reaction to the idea of leaving Venice. That isn't what is motivating this response is not in the full state. He's not in full state of awareness of this. So he's kind of profoundly moved, and yet unconscious of exactly the motivations for this. He's attributing this to an attachment to the city, when we can see that it's the libidinous connection to Tadzio. And we look at the vocabulary, that the diction choice and the vocabulary that Mann uses here, it becomes a grief, because it is about a death of something, real suffering and anguish of the soul. Something deep inside his being is calling him to remain in the city. So bitter that it brought tears to his eyes, in which, as he told himself, he could not possibly have foreseen. There was no way of him knowing, because he is not prepared for the passion of feeling an impulse and kind of Dionysian chaos that the place and the boy is unleashing within him. So then he goes through his typical intellectual acrobatics and convinces himself towards the bottom of this passage, in his typical fashion, that it's an act of kind of martyrdom and sacrifice and heroism to refuse to be defeated by the city itself. And so he goes back to his typical sort of modus operandi of seeing repeated efforts in an Apollonian guise of consistent, forced logic here, attempting to overcome this sense of failure and weakness, which is in some ways a kind of false opposition that he establishes himself in order to justify remaining in the city. So he here frames this problem as a kind of a problem of cowardice, and that he's a weakling if he gives in to this desire to leave. And of course, that's a sort of misguided warping of the thinking that is and feeling that is motivating his decision making. It isn't about heroism. It is about his deep attachment to Tadzio, and we'll see this in the next extract. So, the final question, the final description of Aschenbach's thinking at the end of the chapter. At midday, he caught sight of Tadzio down to it had been so hard for him to leave. So we think here about how this passage builds on the theme of Aschenbach's lack of control in deciding his fate. We're looking at the bottom here of 233. And it reads like this. At midday, he caught sight of Tadzio in his striped linen suit with the red breast knot coming from the sea, through the beach barrier and along the boarded walks back to the hotel. From up here at his window, Aschenbach recognized him at once before he had even looked at him properly, and some such thought came to him as, "Why, Tadzio, there you are again too." But at the same instant he felt that casual greeting die on his lips, stricken dumb by the truth in his heart. He felt the rapturous kindling of his blood, the joy and the anguish of his soul, and realized it was because of Tadzio that it had been so hard for him to leave. Now this is a profound moment of coincidence between, and I mean that in the sense of them both occurring simultaneously rather than luck or randomness, between narrator and Aschenbach. Here's a moment of direct honesty, because this forms some form of epiphany for Aschenbach. And you can tell because it is an honest acknowledgement in Dionysian terms. It is the rapturous kindling of his blood. And so that is what brings about this sense of realization, and his Apollonian aestheticized rationales and his justifications for his interest in Tadzio are killed off at this moment initially by the epiphany that he experiences here, that the question of his loyalty to the place is actually driven by his deep, passionate, subconscious, non-rational, libidinous sexual desire for Tadzio, rather than anything to do with Platonic idealism or beauty. And so we've got here this great moment of honesty that really brings about the end of that section of the text.